Hey, welcome to the HoosLeft Podcast, a show about Indiana politics, history, and culture from an unapologetically leftist perspective. My name is Scott Aaron Rogers, and after some brief technical difficulties, I am here with you live from Bloomington tonight. I've got a very special conversation lined up for you. We've got 4 guests waiting in the wings, and together we are going to discuss democratic socialism, both what it means in political science terms and what it means to each of us. How we get past decades of Red Scare branding. We're going to talk about the national DSA platform, the merits of operating within the Democratic Party versus forming a standalone party, and how much of our focus should even be on electoral politics versus things like social activism and community building. Real quick before we start, please support this independent media project with a subscription at progressiveindiana.net if you're able. That is the best way to help us grow and sustain this work, but you can also help in other ways by liking and sharing on social media, commenting, leaving reviews, providing feedback, and forwarding our content to your people. You get us when you can. Mostly we just want you here in this community of Hoosiers dedicated to making the state and its government work for all of us, not just the elite few. Please join us. You can follow me online on Blue Sky, Instagram, and Threads at whosleft.us and on Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube at whosleft. That is HOOS left. Progressive Indiana Network's handle is the full spelled out name on most sites, but on Blue Sky and TikTok, it is PIN Indiana. Please help us grow with a follow wherever you're at. Tell the others. Let's build a radically democratic Indiana together. All right, enough of the salesmanship. Let's welcome our guests. First, she is the co-founder of Hoosiers for Democracy, a Substack newsletter and organic network of grassroots activists, as well as president of In Good Company Consulting, a practice in the field of organizational development, leadership development, and systems theory. It's Debbie Asberry. Debbie, welcome.
Hey, Scott. Welcome. It's good to be here.
It has been the longest time since I have had the pleasure of having you on one of these live streams. I really do appreciate you being here tonight.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right, let's welcome our next guest, a PhD student, in informatics at Indiana University, an organizer with the school's Graduate Workers Coalition, and an author with works published in Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, Salon, Monthly Review Online, and SheerPost. My Bloomington DSA comrade. It's Bryce Greene. Bryce, welcome.
Good to be here. It's good to be here. It's always good to be here. It's a great show, and I'm proud to be a part of it in any capacity.
We have loved having you on the Sunday show a few times now. Is Bryce ready for prime time? I don't know if prime time's ready for Bryce.
Yeah. That's the line that we're going with.
All right. Our third guest this evening. Joining us is a U.S. Army veteran and small business owner with an MBA in conscious capitalism. She recently ran for the Indiana Democratic Party's nomination for Secretary of State. My good friend, Blythe Potter. Blythe, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I love seeing your face on these. Again, has been entirely too long. Jesse says in the comments that he was wearing your T-shirt earlier today.
Oh, Jesse, thank you.
I've got that
so
same
sweet.
shirt, most comfortable shirt in my drawer.
Good.
It's a good stuff. That's that union bug, right?
It's the union bug.
And finally, this evening is the first elected open socialist in the state of Indiana in more than 100 years, the scourge of the Joe Hogsett administration. It is Indianapolis City County Councilor Jesse Brown. Jesse, welcome.
That's how everyone should be.
Jesse, you are on mute, I believe.
I am indeed. I was just saying how good it was to be the scourge and how good it was to be here with you all. So,
fantastic. All right, I'm going to move some folks around on the screen here. Get the there we go. That is the view I want to roll with. So let us go ahead and begin. And I want to start with a graphic, if I can pull this up on stage here. There we go. So, yes. This summer, after Democratic Socialists won a handful of primary races in Democratic primaries, particularly in New York, I saw graphics like this or similar to this floating around online, trying to define democratic socialism. Some did better jobs than others. This one itself is better than some other ones I've seen, but not perfect in its own right. And I wanted to discuss. I think we're all on the same page. So, certainly, our political opponents would like to define it in a certain way, but I think even with on hindsight, and most of these graphics, I think, are coming from people who are attempting to be helpful, and they're not always right. So let's start there. And Debbie, you over at Hoosiers for Democracy wrote a article on just this.
Yeah, because I had been hearing a lot of just noise in the media around the elections. I think it was in New York when those 5 folks won the election in New York, and they had been endorsed by Zohran Mamdani, and everybody's hair was on fire. And I was hearing Democratic Socialists of America, and I didn't really know what that term was. It was new to me. And so I thought, well, if it's new to me, it's probably new to a lot of my readers. So I did a deep dive. It took about 15 hours to sort of dig through all the stuff to try to figure it all out, and tried to sort of sift out what was a state-owned socialism, what was social democracies, what was socialism, right? And just tried to make the distinction. But there's lots of different viewpoints on it, and I sort of got lost in some of the definitions, and it was not an easy sifting and sorting.
And Jesse, I saw you actually probably give the best explainer of everybody in probably a Facebook thread. I couldn't find it where you gave it, but I think it was probably in a comment, perhaps on a graphic like this. And maybe you can dig in a little more for us.
Yeah, I, like you said, think that most of these are created by people who are trying to help, and they're trying to make it clear that, you could have socialist ideals without necessarily thinking that no socialist or, country who calls itself socialist has ever done wrong, or there's a spectrum of belief, right? And so I think this is closer than almost any that I saw out there. But I do think, it's interesting if you look at socialism in the top row and democratic socialism in the middle row. The top, I think, is correct. It talks about when the people or state collectively own and control the means of production and distribution, which, has for 150 years plus confused people when socialists say we want to get rid of private property, and then people say, "Egads, not my toothbrush. Like, don't, house people in my closet, please." Whereas what we mean is, not private property meaning something that you personally own, but private property meaning a way that you can let your money work for you, right? So today I just did a remonstration against an Airbnb developer from Miami, and they have all these YouTube channels about how they want to use this house as a means of wealth generation, so that they don't have to have a job and just sit back and let the Airbnb pour money into their wallets. That's the means of production, even if it's a house, right? But if I was living in that house, that's not the means of production. That's maybe the means of my social reproduction, but we're getting to split hairs, right? But when we talk about democratic socialism, on the third row, it says we're combining capitalism with strong social programs. And I sure don't want to, as a democratic socialist, because when we look at capitalism on that bottom row, it says that's based on private ownership of property and the means of production. So I think those are fundamentally incompatible, right? You can't have socialism with capitalism. That doesn't mean you can't have markets. That doesn't mean you can't use, market forces in order to help figure out who gets what, when. But I do think that it's a contradiction in terms to have a socialism that's also capitalistic. You could get it for short periods of time in social democracies like Norway, Denmark, Finland, but I don't think those are very durable, and you could tell by the way that they've kind of eroded since the 1970s, even in those countries. So I'll shut up, but I will happily talk at as much length as you want about this topic later.
Well, it's funny, Blythe, I want to come to you because Jesse sort of hinted at the difference between private property and personal property. And the opponents of socialism, the ultra capitalists or the simps for capitalism, as it were, would like to conflate the two. They would say that you're not allowed to own anything. You're not allowed to own your own home. You're not allowed to own your own car. You're not allowed to own your own toothbrush, to Jesse's point. But there is a difference between the two, and a private property I tend to think of as like corporate property or business property. You actually studied conscious capitalism. You are a business owner. So how can you be both a business owner and a socialist at the same time?
Well, like you said, I think maybe Jesse also said this, it's like spectrum. To me, especially in a place like Indiana, I am a member of DSA. And for me, that's saying I believe in democracy. I believe in taking care of the environment. I believe in conscious capitalism, which is we take care of our employees, but we also, like a B Corp for benefit corporation, we care about how the supply chain runs. We care about how my business impacts the environment. Like we do recycling, we do single-use recycling, so we're not just throwing things in the garbage. So being aware of how our footprint affects the community, the environment, our family, our employees, just really being aware of what we're doing as a business and what we're doing to those people who interact with our business.
And Bryce, and I wanted to come back to you. We haven't heard from you at this point yet tonight. Maybe sort of sussing out some of these key differences.
Yeah, I mean, like the first thing that comes to mind when I see these charts is that, oh God, someone made another chart, because they always, because these terms, they're really always in the eye of the beholder, and they're not really precise, and there's a lot of overlap between them. For example, like you have like the capitalism as an economic system. It says like there's limited government intervention, but that's not even remotely true for any capitalist government. I mean, like look at the America. Like America's wealth relies on massive state subsidies, not only of banks, but also the military-industrial complex. This entire business of building a bunch of planes that'll go get destroyed, or building a bunch of missiles that'll go kill children. I mean, that doesn't exist without government intervention. And to say that there's limited government intervention is a misunderstanding of capitalism. And to juxtapose that with a socialist country in which there is also government intervention, you kind of see how kind of incoherent it becomes. Same with like limited political freedom under authoritarian socialism. Like, would you say that we have a lot of political freedom to choose our leaders here in America? I mean, when was the last time you could vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs in a presidential election? You literally can't. Like it's a joke. So I think that this chart was mostly a tool of propaganda to try and get Americans to be less scared of democratic socialism by equating it with countries like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, friendly white countries that are largely considered inoffensive within American public discourse, while not really taking a position on Cuba and Vietnam very clearly, and then being used to criticize the Soviet Union and China and North Korea. This is like the standard like progressive left Overton window that we have, right? It's what Bernie Sanders ran on. We want to have more social democracy. We want to have we want to be like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and we don't want to be like the evil Soviet Union or China or North Korea. Like we can talk more about like how some of these definitions are imprecise, but overall, I think my understanding of socialism comes from and like the difference between a socialist country, a communist country, and a capitalist country is for whose interests is production organized. For like China, for example, they have a mixture of state enterprises and private enterprises, but overall, the interests in which these are developed are for what the Communist Party considers to be the betterment of the people. And we've seen that in the numbers. Like what other system has lifted 800 million people out of poverty? Right. But they still have billionaires. They still have a private wealth class. Then compare that to America, in which all of production is organized for the profits of people. Our healthcare system, it's organized primarily to make profits. The military-industrial complex, primarily to make profits. Every industry, primarily to make profits. The social good be damned. This is the fundamental difference. And like Jesse says, it's a spectrum between, organizing production for the people on one end and organizing production for profit-making capital on the other end. That's, I think, the more important spectrum.
Yeah, and you mentioned China. Oh, who's got the echo? But you mentioned China, and I've had China experts on this show before, and we talked about this, and under no realistic definition would their economic system in China be called communism. It is more of a state capitalism sort of economy. Honestly, Donald Trump in this country is doing things very much like China, as you've seen him take ownership stakes in several companies, including Intel, for example. But I guess I want to talk about, as we could nitpick the various definitions of social, like democratic socialism versus social democracy, like that's very much splitting hairs in its own right. And like, Bryce, you mentioned Bernie Sanders, and I think largely what he is advocating is not democratic socialism, even though he calls it that. He's advocating social democracy, which splitting hairs, but generally I think it is capitalism is the engine of wealth creation, and then the fruits of that creation have a lot more equitable democratic distribution. But I want to talk about what democratic socialism or social democracy or whatever you want to call it means to us. And I've got another graphic here I want to bring up, because I thought this one was better and probably a more accessible way to present it to an American audience. And for folks who are listening and not watching, there are 6 very simple tenets of democratic socialism on this graphic. Democracy first. Free elections, equal rights, and your voice matters. The second one is people over profit, healthcare, education, housing, and all basic needs met. The third is economic fairness, to close the wealth gap and make the economy work for everybody. The fourth one is worker power, strong unions, fair wages, and safe workplaces. A sustainable future, protecting our planet for today and tomorrow. And then the 6th is justice and equality, equal opportunity and respect for every person. Now, listen, Debbie, that doesn't sound very offensive. That doesn't sound radical.
Exactly. And I was just pulling up the article that I wrote on trying to make the distinction between the 3. And I was trying to think, what did I actually say? Because first of all, none of us are economists. And this is an academic conversation. And the voters would be gone 10 minutes ago if we try to engage the voters in the distinction between democratic socialism and social democracies. The way I heard Heather Cox Richardson talk about it early on, when this first was becoming a conversation, I heard her say, is capitalism with guardrails. And I think that what the second graphic looks like, it's like democracy first, right? I mean, we are a democracy. And then what's the economic engine that runs this democracy, and how can we make that economic engine equitable for the common good? Right now, there's a lot of hows in that, and I think there's a lot of different ways in which people would answer that. But I think that this graphic, for me, it helps me understand the Mondamis of the world, the Abduls of the world. It helps me understand Bernie and AOC. We're a democracy. Is it perfect? No, it isn't. But it's, we're trying to strive to be a more perfect union. And I think what's happened right now that makes this conversation more complicated is that the democracy we have is gone. We are under a competitive authoritarianism. That our democracy, the institutions of our democracy have been undermined, and they are failing, and we have got to hopefully begin to rebuild those democratic institutions and be back into the democratic values. Then it is the question of affordability, and how can we minimize that huge wealth gap where we have, the billionaires, top 1 or 2%, probably less than even 1%, and then the rest of us trying to eke out a living. So I think that for me, as I was trying to understand it, and what helped me understand sort of why the Democratic Party wasn't divided into the Democratic Party. Then there's a Republican Party, and then there was the DSA. Why there isn't 3 parties and there's 2. I think this graphic helps me understand that most. It is like capitalism with guardrails. Democracy is the primary value of the governance. That's the way we govern ourselves. And then what's the economic engine that helps it be a more equitable distribution of resources? And it's like FDR. To me, when I heard of went back and studied FDR and the New Deal, I think that's what he was trying to do. And then, of course, as soon as he set out the New Deal, the oligarchs were pissed and tried to undo it for decades. They have been trying to undo the New Deal for decades. And I think the DSA
and at this point,
let's bring it back in.
Yeah, from Reagan onward, I would say they've largely succeeded at rolling back the vast majority of the New Deal. I mean, not only did they try to repeal it through legal means, they also plotted to kill FDR in the 1930s unsuccessfully, thankfully. But you mentioned, Debbie, that we've sort of lost our democracy, and I wanted to point out, it was never really perfect in the first place. There are a lot of flaws in the American democratic system that sort of point us in a 2-party direction, and to Bryce's point earlier, sort of limits the options that we even have, that we even choose from. There are a lot of upstream problems. We're very much still running like 1780s operating system here in the 2020s. But Jesse, I wanted to come to you. I like to think in simple terms that democratic socialism is adding more democracy to the economy as well.
Yeah, I don't think that's a bad way of framing it at all. And I think a couple points that were made earlier are really important when we're talking about socialism, democratic or otherwise, is, you see the common right-wing canard little talking point is, socialists just want free stuff, right? Socialists don't understand that you actually have to turn a profit in order to have that productive capability to create things. And it's a very, very silly argument when you think about the fact that Karl Marx wrote hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages talking about the system of capitalism. And, not all of it holds up 100% perfectly, 150 years later, but he did pretty damn well. And almost every even capitalist economist, I should say, learned a lot from him, and we developed from what he had way back then, obviously pre-iPad, right? So it is important that whether it is through, Bryce mentioned China still allows, a market-based economy and the accumulation of wealth and the profit motive to drive a lot of its economic growth. What they do is you could become a billionaire as long as you don't try to get involved in politics. When you start getting involved in politics, that's when you disappear into a camp. But it is important that we have productive capabilities. Like in that first chart, the one thing that was actually pretty much 100% correct, other than a couple little details, was communism, right? Communism was the goal that Karl Marx described as the stateless, classless society where there's plenty for everybody, and we don't really need to worry so much about politics the way we think about it today. That's kind of what I personally, when people say, "Oh, you're a commie," I don't disagree with that future. I do want to get to that future. And so I'm, don't necessarily choose that label first and foremost when talking to people who don't understand what the word means. But actually, yes, I am a communist. But what I think socialism is, it comes down to really those first top two: democracy first and people over profit. That doesn't mean instead of profit, right? It means we still have to build up our productive capabilities, but we have to do so under democratic oversight, right? And so I like this chart because it doesn't say like, it has to have Medicare for all and it has to have X or Y or Z. It simply lets us all vote on what we want. And, I would actually beg to differ that, we ever had that actually in this country. When we look at the time period when, for example, women could vote and when they weren't, for example, rounding up socialists and throwing them in prison for their speech, including socialists who were running for office, like there's basically no overlap in that Venn diagram, right? So for the entirety of this country's history, you have been required to either agree with certain basic things that aren't actually written down anywhere, but they're just part of the status quo, and or have had property. Otherwise, you don't get a vote. And the reason for that is because if you put it up to a vote, whether or not, for example, we have slavery, I know a whole lot of human beings would vote no on that, right? But that was foundational to our developing economy. Similarly, if you vote, who gets to have their third house before all the kids are fed, the vast majority of human beings will vote feed the children first. But, Jeff Bezos can't have that because it's important that they have what they want before we all get to choose. And so, I think that it can be a little, I don't want to necessarily say Pollyanna-ish or naive, but I really do believe that the vast majority of people are socialists who just don't know it and don't know the terminology yet. Because what we all learn in kindergarten that comes very naturally to human beings is take care of each other, share with each other, make sure everybody's needs are met. And, don't be a jerk to anybody. Like that's the type of stuff that'll get you to sit in the corner. And yet, that's how CEOs and the people who succeed most in our system operate on a daily basis. And so, like, what do we do when we are all in charge of the economy? I think we probably provide healthcare for everybody. We provide food for everybody. We make sure everybody has a decent place to sleep. We make sure people can get around, but we also are spending out of a communal bank account, right? And there are collective action problems. As a society, we haven't learned how to work with each other to solve all the problems yet. We haven't flexed those muscles in a while, but we can't keep feeding ourselves out of a trough that isn't filling, right? I mean, we have to produce, and we can't say, oh, now we all get a yacht, right? There aren't enough yachts to go around. So we have to make some decisions about distribution, not just production. But what those decisions actually are, it's up to us. Under socialism, there isn't we don't pull out the book of Marx and check page 384. Oh, it turns out here that now we have to put our resources into X or Y. No, we get to decide. And so really, it just is democracy, full stop. I believe that once people see how the economy works, we will naturally become more and more kind of socialist in terms of taking care of each other, in terms of realizing that when we're building bombs and missiles, that's actually a really terrible return on our investment and not great the way our current GDP would measure it. And so I think we will naturally move in the direction of that stateless society called communism. And I'm personally, I'll use the term democratic socialist because I'm a pacifist. And so, not big for armed revolution. Think that would be a very bloody and bad thing. And think that just everybody sharing is the way that we should at least be orienting towards ourselves right now. Again, I'll shut up. Sorry.
No, very good. Lots of good stuff there, Jesse. And thank you for pointing out that, like, communism is, despite the branding that a place like the Chinese Communist Party or the Soviet Union used, they were not communist societies. Communism is aspirational rather than practical. It's not something that has ever been enacted anywhere, and it's a place you'd like to get. You mentioned the things you learn in a kindergarten classroom. I think of the words of a certain Jewish Palestinian carpenter about 2,000 years ago, who also talked about taking care of people that needed the most help. And other folks have noticed this in the chat. Blythe said, literally. You're talking about Jesus. Jesus would have advocated for these things and essentially did as much. Blythe, I haven't heard from you in a while. What does democratic socialism mean to you?
Not what we have now. I think I like to say Democrat, like DSA, more as like signaling. If you really look at the Democratic Party values, it's quite socialist. We just don't practice that as Democrats on the grand scale because we are too tied to corporate interests. But it is like, we grew up with the "What would Jesus do" bracelets and be nice and listen to what Jesus says. And then you actually practice that and that you call yourself a socialist. And then suddenly you are now the devil.
Yeah, yeah. Jesus wouldn't lift up the least of these. Jesus is only here for slut shaming, apparently.
Right? It's so bizarre.
Bryce, I guess I want to come to you here and get your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways to go about talking about this. There's the way in which you would talk to, like, the broader American public about socialism, and in which case, yeah, the best way to understand it is embodying these Christian values that everyone has. In fact, that all religions have this values of protecting each other, of ensuring that the least among us are still have some minimum a base of security. And the only way that we can enact those values is by, taking on the billionaires and taking on the ruling class. But then there's another way of talking about this, and the in terms of, like, historical developments, and like I do kind of want to push back on this idea that, like, there hasn't been a communist government, because these government words are funny, right? If a government calls themselves a communist government, I mean, there's good reason to usually take them on those terms. And this is what some analysts like to call the category of actually existing communism. Or right, like the Cuban Revolution, or the Bolshevik Revolution, or the revolution in China. Like, these are real, like, communist projects. They very explicitly noted that, yes, their end goal is to go to a communist state, but in order to do that, they need to go through a period of historical development, which was traditionally called socialism, so that they can develop the productive forces, and also the big one is defend themselves against counter-revolution, right? Defend themselves against America, defend themselves against like internal elements that wanted to bring back the monarchy or bring back feudalism or things like that. And in that sense, then I would say that there have been communist projects, and I would say that these communist projects, they have many shortcomings, but they have actually been successful. Look at the Soviet Union. They took a country full of peasants under essentially feudal lords, under a king, under a monarch. And then within a generation, they were competing with the United States and sending rockets into space. They didn't do that on accident. They did this because they had an understanding of how to develop productive forces. And then take China, for example. China's still existing, and it's still defending itself against imperialist aggression. It's still able to encourage development in places like Africa and other parts of Asia. It's still able to ensure that their people are their standards of living are increasing. But these conversations can get highly academic, and most Americans aren't really thinking about Chinese development. Most Americans aren't thinking about, how do I do a balance of payments so our people don't starve if I do a revolution in Cuba. No, most people are thinking about bread and butter issues. And so I think it's the task of socialist, or anyone left of center, anyone who considers themselves to be an advocate of an alternative society, where the ruling class, the billionaires, don't dominate every economic decision of distribution, of production. People who advocate that, their task is to build consensus among the American people around a very popular program that would move us closer to social democracy, that would move us closer to socialism, that would, in theory, move us closer to a communist utopia. And I think everyone, if you ask them, well, should we embark on a massive New Deal development to rebuild America's infrastructure and make sure that the gains of this development go towards the people rather than enriching a few billionaires, they'd say absolutely. In fact, I was talking with it was like the student for Trump or something, like some Trump student group. I walked by and said, I was talking about the wars, but then I asked, hey, do you support Medicare for all? And he said, no, we can't have the government in charge of healthcare. But what we should do, and he agreed that it would be very good to have service available to everybody that's free at the point of service. And he said the way to do that is to take the government money that's going into our current healthcare system and instead divert it to local nonprofits who can just provide care for free for people. And I said, okay, all right. What he's talking about is actually more radical than Medicare for all. It's talking about nonprofit hospitals and nonprofit healthcare providers. That's more radical than Medicare for all. But because of his ideological framework that he's working in, he would never say that. He would say that I'm just trying to solve the needs of the people. But I think that since the needs of the people are so universal, the main task is overcoming the big propaganda waves, the anti-communism that's been lingering since the 1920s, and to provide a way of understanding how to make good things happen in America from a political perspective.
Bryce, I'm glad you mentioned that, because you took me right where I wanted to go next, and that is talking about this with folks who have been propagandized against these concepts for decades now, more than a century at this point. They threw Eugene V. Debs in jail during World War II World War I for speaking out against an imperialist war, and he was an avowed socialist, and that was well over 100 years ago at this point. And then, move forward onto that. We talked about FDR and the attacks leveled against him. They called him a communist. They called him all sorts of fun things, and tried to coup him. Then his successor, Harry Truman, who, I've got my own beef with Truman, but he made perhaps one of my favorite observations about talking about socialism and dealing with the attacks on it. And I've got another graphic for you here tonight. So this is Harry Truman in 1952, quote, "Socialism is a scare word they have hurled at every advance the people have made in the last 20 years. Socialism is what they called public power. Socialism is what they called social security. Socialism is what they called farm price supports. Socialism is what they called bank deposit insurance. Socialism is what they called the growth of free and independent labor organizations. Socialism is their name for almost anything that helps all the people." Debbie, he's right. He's right.
Absolutely. So a couple things, just to circle back. I worked for many years in a nonprofit hospital, and the nuns reminded us over and over again that nonprofit was a tax status, not an economic goal. So I think there's a little bit of, nostalgia about that. And then the other thing that I did, as I was listening to Bryce and others talk about communism and socialism, I'm a writer. The root word of economy is oikos, and it also means household. And so the truest sense of really having an economic system that works for all people is to get back to that common purse kind of thing. And I think that was what, Jesse, you said. We have a common pot, right? Now, how we get there, right, with the production, the way we make the profit, the way we make money, that's way beyond my mental capacities at this point. And I forgot what I was going to say to you. Tell me what you were saying. What did you ask me? So what I want to say, I remembered. Absolutely. Truman he's absolutely right, I think, in the way that he's explaining that. Anat Osario tells us over and over and over, as we are talking to the voter, sell the brownie, not the recipe. I'm hearing a lot of recipes that get us to common goods that most people, probably 60 to 70% of people would say, hell yes, I want that. And we cannot, I think that the propaganda and the divisiveness and the thing that's sort of tearing us apart is the use of language and how we all attribute meaning to those different words, right? And so it's just, so what's the brownie? The brownie is, free and independent labor organizations, farm prices that support, the capacity to be able to go to the doctor and still pay the electric bill, right? Even terms like access to health care is too abstract for people. I've heard Anat say, it's like, well, what does that mean? It means I can go to the doctor and get my babies vaccinated, and I'm not going to break the bank, the family household budget. So I do think that as we're moving into these elections, and as we're trying to build a broad coalition of people who really are just trying to get back to not back to, because we need to keep improving, but to get to some semblance of sanity and equity. I think we have to help people understand and speak to them as leaders, as candidates, and Blythe, you were so brilliant and still are so brilliant at that. You didn't wear a label across your t-shirt. You just said, here's what I want to do for you. If I were to be Secretary of State, I want a really nice voter guide, right? I want to make the website easy so that I'm a small business owner. The InBiz website makes me crazy. I break out in hives when I have to file my frickin' business entity report, right? And so I think help people, say to people what it is that they want, speak to them. Mondami was masterful. He didn't campaign on any terms. He said, let's control rent and let's get food markets into the urban centers, grocery stores into the urban centers, and let's make buses free. And so it was like, here's what I will do for you. And then it was, very successful. And I think AOC does that. I think Bernie does that. Candidates like Blythe does that. And I think that that's what we need to really help as we move towards these elections and try to move away from the propaganda and the divisiveness and the language that just confuses people. Let's just talk about what we need our leaders to do for the American people. And I want to get back to some of the things that, Bryce, you talked about. Elizabeth Warren did all kinds of amazing things to put some of those guardrails on the big banks and the consumer protections. And of course, what was the first thing that Trump undid was the consumer protections, right? And so there is a way in which you can vote for a candidate that will begin to put some of these accountabilities and limits on these monoliths of our financial institutions. But that's going to take a lot of hard work. So now I'm going to be quiet because I've talked too much.
No, well, so Jesse, I guess I want to talk about messaging to Debbie's point, and I want to tie this into the things that Truman said, because we will always be labeled as socialists, well, because we are, but it is thrown around like a slur in many circles, and I think Democrats or folks in the broad liberal left in this country have spent so much time on the defensive, running away from this accusation. Like, no, Social Security isn't socialism, even though they share the root word. I mean, obviously, the farm supports, something that our farmers in this state, Indiana, obviously a heavily agricultural state, could not function without. At all, these subsidies, and we've run away from them instead of saying, "Yep, that is socialism," and owning it.
Yeah, I mean, I always use the example of Thomas Horrocks, who ran for office pretty close to you all. Who, great guy, National Guardsman, pastor, and did not run as a socialist, and yet he got attack ads mailed to everybody in his district with the hammer and sickle on it, talking about communism and Karl Marx. And so to me, that just shows you're not getting away from this no matter what. You can't just choose not to use these words and hope that they won't follow you around. And so I think it is important, even if it's a difficult path, to start educating people about why these words are important, what they actually mean, and why the ruling class has been afraid of them for over 100 years. And, I think everybody should read the book Hammer and Hoe, which is about the Alabama Communist Party from the 1910s through 1950s, basically. Because it was interesting that the word was communism that they used. And so they were very opposed to communists. There really were communist organizers there who were working to end segregation. And that was actually what all of the segregationists and right-wingers attacked them for. They said, the worst thing about communists is that they believe in equality between the races. Can you believe that? And so even when, like you could attack them on the actual economics of it, where they were attacked is where they were the most threat to the prevailing ruling order. And again, Eugene V. Debs was a socialist. He was talking openly about socialism, ran for office multiple times as a Socialist Party leader. But what he got thrown in prison for wasn't talking about socialism. It was talking about war. It was talking about opposing World War I and getting involved in that and calling it, poor people killing other poor people. And so I don't know that it's actually going to save us to just focus on issues as opposed to on terminology. I think at the end of the day, what we need is class consciousness, and we need people to see that they have more in common with each other than with the billionaires, and that dividing against each other is the biggest threat. Or that's the way the billionaires keep their power, right? And so when we know that class consciousness and solidarity are the weapons that we're going to use in order to bring back this peace, this democracy, this better way of living, we should show solidarity with people to our left who use labels that we personally aren't super comfortable with. Because when you think about it, and kudos to everybody on this call. I haven't heard anybody do that, and that's great. But if we say, oh gosh, well, we definitely, let's spend a bunch of time and energy talking about how we don't want these like authoritarian excesses of the USSR or China. Why would we need to talk about that? If we're concerned about authoritarian excesses, there are masked secret police in American cities right now shooting people to death. What possible fear of something 70 years ago could override that? Why don't we just talk about authoritarianism in our own society and oppose that? And by opposing it, show we're not, we're the ones fighting against the mass surveillance state. We're the ones fighting against the unchecked power of the government over the people. And so I've had people be like, oh, well, say you're socialist, but don't say you're a communist, because communist scares people about the authoritarianism. I was like, go look at Facebook on any right-wing news story about what's going on, even just today and yesterday in Bloomington and today. There are people actively cheering on masked agents of the state who are accountable only to the president. Mind you, that's while they have the oldest and least physically healthy president in American history. And so basic first grader logic should show you, oh, even if we're okay with it happening under this president won't be around forever. So maybe this is a bad precedent to set. I just really don't think that it's worth our time to try to distance ourselves from any project on the left, no matter how wrongheaded or no matter how ineffective it was, or no matter how different it would be than what our projects are here in the United States. Because I think, all the history I've shown shows me that the vast, vast majority of people who have used the term socialist and communist really did do what they thought was best to try to help the majority of people in their country. Would not have been the same as my choices. Again, I'm a pacifist. That puts a whole lot of different socialist and communist activity well out of my spectrum. I wouldn't have been the one fighting the Nazis to save Europe, right? But I do think it's important to talk through, yes, these labels are going to be weaponized against us, and people who misunderstand it are going to recoil. And I think that we just need to be there and be like, okay, I can see you're concerned about that. Here's what I'm doing. What my strategy has always been as an elected official is to say, I've got these crazy left-wing ideas, but I'm just doing what my constituents want. What about the rest of you guys who take giant capitalist donations? And it turns out that even though their constituents are telling them the same things that mine are telling me, they don't do what their constituents want because they're bought off. And so I don't, I could say that all day long, but that sounds like sour grapes. I have to show people that. Be like, I don't know why. My guess is because they take their money. Ask them what they say, and just let people see for themselves the coercive and corrupting influence of money in politics. So it seems to work pretty well so far.
Well, you got at it there. Like when you strip away the labels from things and you actually talk about the policies and what you want to do for people, we actually, turns out, for the most part, are in agreement on most of these things. Blythe, I know you've got to hop in the car. Can I ask you a question, or do you need to drop off for a couple minutes?
Oh yeah, ask away. I will still be listening. I'll just be moving around.
Okay, great. So, well, I want to say you grew up in a conservative family. You
Yep.
live in a conservative part of the state. You've got to talk to these folks, and I think a lot of the time when the Trump people talk about "Make America Great Again," they are largely, listen, we know boomers are a big portion of his constituency, and they romanticize that sort of post-war era, the 1950s, when you could raise a family on a single income and things were, the standard of living was improving for a lot of people. And I think it is largely separated from the fact that what allowed those things to happen was the New Deal policies of FDR. We sort of lived in that greater New Deal era. We had high union density. We had the government actually doing things. We had a top marginal tax rate on the wealthiest Americans of 90% or more. I guess how make America great again? Okay. Does that mean we're going to raise taxes to 90%? Does that mean we're going to have high union density? Does that mean we're going to engage in massive infrastructure projects? Okay, great. Sign me up.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I don't know if we'd been able to communicate the way that we do now and share information in real time, we probably wouldn't have gotten here. But you can tell they took advantage of the fact that newspapers are how people got their news, or then television. And then that's where they started getting their claws into it and saying all of the propaganda. Like, how did we get to this space where we claim to be a Christian state or country, but we do the exact opposite? And that's what's normalized. It's so weird. All of it's so weird.
It is weird. It is largely, I think, Bryce, an exercise in branding. Oh no. Anyway, Bryce, I'll turn it over to you. It is. I think folks are largely they have a loyalty to a brand or a label, whether it's MAGA or whether it's Republican or whether they hold some affinity for those brand, or if they just hate the other guys without realizing what those things stand for.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, it's why the guy I was talking to, that kid for Trump, was like, yeah, no, he is in favor of people getting health care. He is against people getting medical debt, and he also said he was against foreign wars, but he decided that he's on Team Trump. And so if you're on Team Trump, then you just got to go with these things. You can be susceptible to the branding that labels good things as bad, right? You can be susceptible to people saying, well, Medicare for all is bad, or if we end the wars, that would be bad. Like how how many jobs the war creates, and you wouldn't want these evil Chinese to take over, and so you go along with the dominant ideology. And then if you do that enough, I mean, most of the things that determine the health of our economy, the health of the state, the health of the public, they're not even up for public debate. Right? They're not even. When was the last time we debated whether or not the Federal Reserve should lower its definition of full employment? Like, when was the last time we debated whether or not, like in any of these things? Like these things are so far out of the bounds of the public discourse that public discourse is now reduced to, are you, do you or do you not care about children's genitals in sports? Like that it gets reduced to things that have no bearing on these questions of distribution and production. And as we mentioned earlier, like, if we're serious about changing the world, these questions of distribution and production are the ones that you need to be looking at. And so, but if you look at the polls, the DSA agenda, like almost all of it is extremely popular. Like, most people are in favor. If you describe a Green New Deal to somebody, say, oh yeah, big revitalization with environmental concerns designed to give money to the people, they would say absolutely. If you said, free healthcare, people would say absolutely. If you said, oh, we need to support labor unions against major corporations, they'd say yes. If you say you want to tax billionaires more so that their wealth comes to is distributed to the people, people would say absolutely. I mean, people forget that tax rates under Eisenhower, the corporate tax, there's people were getting 90% of their surplus wealth taxed and distributed by the state. Eisenhower is not a socialist. He is not.
Although the far right, they called him one too.
But they called him one too. And I know some people calling Trump a socialist. I've seen this on the internet. So it's all about the branding. It's all about what you've been propagandized for. And some people are, less propagandized against the bad things, but they still don't have a full critique of the system, right? They'll say, yes, I would love healthcare and I would love everything Bernie's saying, but I really like this Pete Buttigieg guy. Or, like they would say things like that. And uh, it's the depoliticization of American politics. And I think that that's one of the reasons why you get Obama and Trump and Biden and these cycles of sameness dominating our entire political space.
Yeah, you mentioned that all of these proposals generally on the progressive left are popular, right? I guess I want to dig in to some of those and look at the recently passed platform from the national DSA, because it has, become again a talking point on the right. Inevitably they focus in on like one or two things, and I want to talk about those because listen, these again are largely popular positions to hold, and I don't know if I want to run through all of them, but there are generally three major categories. Again, I'm going to sort of read through these for the folks who are listening and not watching, but the three major categories are thriving working class communities, a working class foreign policy, and working class democracy. And we can dig into each of those a little bit more, but inevitably, Debbie, the right focuses on, abolish the police, right? Get rid of prisons. And what Jesse was talking about with communism, I think those are aspirational goals and not something we would like do tomorrow.
Absolutely. And so again, it can come down to a framing issue and a messaging issue. And if we have to explain ourselves, we've lost the attention span of our listener, because we have like so many seconds to get the message across, and then they're gone because we're such, social media has completely changed our brain. And so again, I think that what's important is for us to not confuse the means to the end. That's what we get the propaganda, is where they're hurling labels at us. And I agree with Jesse. And I hope it didn't sound like I was saying running from the labels. You just don't lead with the labels, because that's not what people care about right now. They care about what Jesse did for them. And I think Mondami, again, is such a great object lesson. He could call himself a framing communist, and nobody in New York's going to give a shit, because he is delivering the goods, right? So they don't care who he is, because he does what the people wanted. He is a leader who delivers what the constituents want. And so I remember way back in the George Floyd, just those horrible days where we watched the murder of this gentle giant. Oh God. And then, so in our despair about that, in our seeing the abuse of a militarized police force, the frame defund the police was loud and became sort of popular, and it absolutely destroyed politicians who sort of framed that, to use that, because people misunderstood it. And then they had to go back and say, well, I don't mean to fund the police. Of course, fund the police, but make money for mental health agencies. And if you call 911, you're able to distinguish, is this a mental health crisis? Is this a homeless person? Or is this somebody about to kill his wife, right? And so, again, it's just the way in which what people hear, abolish capitalism, or even abolish, I am now saying absolutely on the street corners in our weekly protests, I am saying abolish ICE. There is no reforming that corrupt, militarized, just police force that's out there. But I do think that it's just important to be able to speak. I guess I'm speaking more about get out the vote, because I really do believe right now that if we don't get past this midterm, we are really in worse trouble than we are in now. And so we have to help people understand the urgency of why it is so important. And I've been listening a lot to both Sarah Longwell and Anat, because they run the focus groups, and they run focus groups on everyday Americans. So it's not the people probably listening to this podcast as we're parsing language around these frames. And they said over and over and over again, the voter does not start paying attention until way after Labor Day. And it's not fair to really call them low information voters or low propensity voters. Those sort of have judgment. They're busy people just trying to eke out a living. And so what they can pay attention to is, what they will pay attention to is, how can you help me make my life more equitable, easier, so that I can do the kinds of things that I want to do, of just making a living and having my kids being able to go to school without fearing of being shot and all of those things. So I agree, let's not run from the labels, and they are going to paint us with every propaganda label they can as they become more and more frightened that we are about to take over the Senate and the House. And so it's just really to talk about what people care about. And you're absolutely right, both Bryce and Jesse, the platform of the DSA, the things that they want to deliver, people go, hell yeah, hell yeah, hell yeah. That's what I want. And so it's don't run from the label, but really be able to frame the argument in a way that people can hear, and not amplify the propaganda. And Anat says that over and over and over again. Don't say, oh, I'm not a socialist, or I'm not a communist, because you've already using their frame. It's like, you know what, I care deeply about what you care about, and I want to deliver for what the people want, and that kind of message. So I think the other thing is that in our conversations, for those of us who have the bandwidth and have the privilege of being able to speak about these things from a more of an academic perspective, I think that we need to be careful that we don't confuse the means to the end. Many of the things that we talk about is the how, and I think the how is up for lots of good conversation, right? And there's going to be a whole continuum of ways in which people are going to talk about the how, where we're all trying to get to the end, right? What is it that we're wanting for the end? We want an equitable economic system. We want a democracy that works for the people. And those, I think, are our talking points. It's the end point. And then if we can get enough of the right people elected, so that becomes the vision for those elected, then you have the policy debates about how we're going to get there.
Yeah, we do. I think, especially on the left, Jesse joked about it earlier, is that we very much argue a lot over the how, and tend to forget about the why and what we're aiming for. And as I've got this platform up on the screen, there is very little of it that I think most people would find objectionable, like freedom to flourish. Under that bullet point, they talk about working less, right? Paid family leave for all workers, a 32-hour full-time work week with full pay and benefits, and a living minimum wage, free quality public education all the way from pre-K through college, and to not be burdened with debt for having gone through schooling, universal health care. To Bryce's point, folks on the right would advocate for this as well. It polls well. Housing for all. Like, no one's going to argue that people shouldn't have a home. One of the things on this point is to finish Reconstruction, which we largely abandoned before we fully finished that project. In the wake of the Civil War, and never fully addressed those the generational effects of racism in this country, aside from the most hardcore racists, which I think they all fit in a tent in Thorntown about a month ago. It's a handful of crazy people. Most Americans are going to agree with racial equity in our country. You both mentioned Bryce and Jesse, I think, both mentioned that a lot of folks on the right, they rallied behind President Trump because he said he was going to end the forever wars. Obviously, we see he's not doing it, but we're actually out there talking about it and fighting for it. Palestine, this has become a generational issue. Most folks on the U.S. left now see that Israel is far out of line with our morals and values here in this country. Even Republicans under the age of 50 are now siding more with Palestinians in that age-old struggle. What are they taking objection to here? The real Democratic Congress point. I think they focused on. You see this on Fox News, like, oh, they want to abolish the Senate. Like, okay, I mean, I honestly, it probably is a great idea. Now, constitutionally, is that something we could do? No, but I do think we need to do things like admit more states to.
Well, we can change the Constitution.
Well, yes, we can. It's exceedingly difficult because we are running that 1780s software or operating system. But things that we could do without an amendment are like admitting new states, so as to undo the imbalance, the undemocratic nature of the Senate that greatly over rewards low population rural states in that body. I want to say, they essentially like 20% of the population of this country holds veto power over the rest via the Senate. That is something that should be addressed. And I don't know. I don't want to harp on that particular point, Bryce, but overall, this is not a terribly radical platform.
No, it's really not. Like you said, like people believe that people should be living in homes. People believe that people should have health care. People believe that our democratic institutions should function as advertised. It takes so much distraction and propaganda to get people away from that, which is why I agree with what everyone's saying, is that the messaging matters so much. I mean, if we want to go into a policy debate, about whether or not we should try and nationalize this or that company, or should we try and break it up and then regulate it as a market, these are all very interesting conversations, I think. And I think I firmly believe more socialists should be having them. But most, your average like working person isn't really thinking about that. Your average working person, they see the horse race on TV. They see they see the signals that they're receiving from politicians, and then they react accordingly. And I like what you said, Deborah, about we shouldn't disparage these people who are too busy to be as freakishly glued to every single world event as they possibly can, like us. These are normal people. We're the weird ones. We are the weird ones. And so, like, if you want to run as a socialist, if you believe in these, classless, stateless society ends, as socialists do, the question is about tactics. And there's a lot of questions about tactics that are kind of excluded from this body today. I think, Jesse, you mentioned that I'm like the far left of the DSA spectrum. I'm actually a centrist as far as DSA goes. I fall in between these opposing poles. There's a poll in DSA that's saying, well, we should just become Democrats and then make Democrats better. Okay, but that ignores the structural reasons for why the Democratic Party is the way that it is. Then there's another faction of DSA that's like, well, I oppose electoralism, and even the question of whether or not we should vote Democrat is missing the point, and we should be building up institutions that are outside of that traditional power game, which I'm sympathetic to. But again, that ignores the reality of how things change in this country. So I'm a bit of a centrist on that. And, there are people even, quote unquote, further to the left, ultra left, who say, well, even the DSA, because they have a faction that wants to engage with the Democrats, they're far too radical. I'm not going to touch them. Then you start moving towards, like the Kashama Sawants, who I have a great deal of respect for. But I think I disagree with her tactically. and the way that she uses to use her rhetoric. But so that whole spectrum I think is important. But if we're talking about how do we do change in America, I think that centrist position of yes and we do need to engage with the Democratic Party. We do need to engage with the democratic institutions as it exists, if for no other reason than by not engaging it, we're ceding that ground to freaks, to people who are we're ceding that ground to Hakeem Jeffries. We're ceding that ground to the Joe Biden wing of the Democratic Party, and that's not something that I think is a good strategy. Now you can say that, well, we want the empire to fall. We want to heighten the contradictions of capitalism. Essentially, that argument is saying we want to make life worse for people in the hopes that some good magically comes out of this. This isn't a real serious position, and but I do think that they have good analysis and a good critique of the system as it exists. So I consider them, comrades, and I respect a lot of them, and just don't ask them about how they're going to vote.
Jesse, but I think Bryce was describing accelerationism, and you definitely see a certain faction of that over here on the left, and the reason, to his point, they do have the correct analysis, I think, and that a lot of people will not get it until things really get bad and it affects them personally. But I don't think we should be encouraging things to collapse to get to that point.
And I would even say, I mean, are people not paying attention? I thought that when I was a teenager and we were engaged in overseas wars and, things were really bad here for some people of color, that was as low as it was going to go. And I honestly, even the leftist, conspiracy theorists who were like, oh gosh, we're going to run into situations where we're having more and more wars over oil, and we'll have, I remember Alex Jones at the time frothing at the mouth, talking about how we would have, masked police in the streets shooting people, and everyone treated him the way people treat Alex Jones, as totally crazy. Not as though, it's happening, right? It's happening. Things already are so much worse than I thought they would ever get. And that does not appear to be triggering a communist revolution. So I think that accelerationism has proven in my lifetime to be false. It doesn't work. I had a couple things I want to say about the platform. I know we're already going a little bit long here, but number one, even though I'm no longer a DSA member right now, I stand behind the entire platform for a couple of reasons. One, I agree it's not actually that radical. Two, it was democratically decided. And I think that the practice of creating a program for DSA is an important flexing of those muscles. Like I said, we're going to have to try to figure out how to do that collectively. And we're starting to see, elected officials have a much harder time defending a more radical program. And so there's this friction between some people who've been very happy to have DSA volunteers to get them elected, but didn't want to actually govern as though DSA was an essential, base of support for them. And I think that is causing some friction, and we're going to grow and learn from that. But I also just briefly wanted to push back slightly on this defund the police narrative, because that is like a fundamentally right-wing narrative. There weren't really any politicians in 2020 who were running on the slogan defund the police. Activists used that slogan, and centrist Democrats who actually did not want to change the nature of the police knelt with kente cloths and pretended like they were supporters of that movement, and then didn't move forward with it. And that is the surest sign to political failure, is to look like a sellout and a hypocrite to the left, and to look like you're, some bleeding radical to the centrists and to the right. They got rid of all their base of electoral support, and some centrists and moderate Democrats did lose elections, and people said it was because I saw you were in the same camp as those defund the police people. And I think that if they aren't on the page of defund the police, meaning, and I'm just reading from the longer version of the DSA program right now, demilitarize police departments, disempower police unions, and redirect funding to public services as steps towards fully abolishing the police and prison system, which protects the rich and jails the poor. If anybody doesn't
that's not nearly as
that,
catchy a slogan. Yeah.
If anybody doesn't agree with that, though,
line.
they are not my political ally. They don't want the same things I want. And so to the extent they try to be in the same party with me and I mean, they're gonna throw me under the bus. You know, we had this House resolution. Democrats repeatedly kowtow to their donors and show off the fact that they are very willing to throw lefties to under the bus or to the wolves, whichever metaphor you want, at no provocation. Like, no one has to even snap their fingers before they will try to throw the left away, while getting frustrated about the fact that the left is where actually the base of support for the Democratic Party exists. Because the Democratic Party establishment, to overgeneralize, relies upon left-wing energy through unions, through organized working class people who want these things that the DSA is talking about, and they want to grift off of that energy and then actually deliver things very similar to what Republicans run on. And that doesn't work. And so you need to keep having that base of energy to grift off of. And so that's my biggest concern about too much engagement within the powers that be within the Democratic Party. I would agree with Bryce that we should be using the whatever parties exist. We should be running within the Democrat. I ran as a Democrat, right? So we should be doing that wherever it makes sense. But what I didn't do is refuse to endorse people because that might make some other Democrat mad. What I didn't do was bite my tongue about Joe Hogsett because he ran as a Democrat. And I think that when we show that our loyalty is with the people, they're not going to be like, oh, well, you're a Democrat, so I'm not going to vote for you. But they're also not going to be like, oh, you're a Democrat, and therefore, I can't listen to you if I would consider myself more conservative or, otherwise don't work with people. As long as people can see that you are working with and for them, I think that's what matters. And labels, I mean, to Debbie's point earlier, can sometimes get in the way. And I have had people who said, the very first time I sent out a mailer, my wife helped edit it. And the first guy whose door I knocked answered the door. He was this, very stereotypical white working class guy with paint splattered overalls. He opened the door. He's like, wait a second, you're Jesse Brown? I was like, yeah. He's like, I got a letter from you. I was like, oh, you're the first person I've talked to who's read it. Like, what'd you think? And he went, that's the best damn letter I've ever read. But are you sure you're a Democrat? And so, there are people who were like less likely to vote for me because I ran as a Democrat. So no matter what, I think the labels are going to cause us trouble. And no matter what, people are going to try to, narratively, dissolve a lot of complex activity into a couple labels. And that's always going to cause confusion. But I think that as long as you're routinely and consistently showing people that you fight for the working class, that you aren't bought off, that's what matters most to people. And that's what's going to let us be successful.
I want to talk about the sort of situation that we find ourselves in within the Democratic coalition. I feel like it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation in many places. Like when I think it was right after the New York primaries, and Jamie Harrison, the former DNC chair, said, if you hate the Democratic Party so much, well, why are you running within it? Why don't you go form your own party? And yet, if DSA were to run candidates independently, they would say that we were taking away we were splitting the left vote and ensuring that Republicans win. Well, which one is it? Do you want us as part of this big tent or not? I feel like, Debbie, they largely want us in the tent and to vote as such, but to just shut up while we're there.
Yeah, and I think I want to get back to get rid of the Senate because there's a connection there. Structurally, we have a problem as a democracy. The structure that we have with the electoral system in the Senate particularly, and of course now with gerrymandering, and this could be another whole segment, is that we are living under a minority rule. We are not living under a majority rule, right? And we really need we don't need to engage voters in that conversation right now because it's too hard to explain what that means, right? But we need to elect leaders who understand that because there needs to be some structural changes that need to be made because it is suffocating us as a democratic republic. And the other thing that I have become more and more convinced about is that the two-party system is killing us. We are too big of a state, too big of a nation to only have the two parties, and so I don't know why. I don't understand Parliament and I don't understand all of that, and I need to go back and sort of get clear about those things. But if we had more parties that were legitimately, bona fide parties, I think it would be a better system for our democracy. But the getting there is going to be painful, right? And I don't know that we could or would, but I do agree that if we could have a strong independent party, or if we could have a strong labor party like they have in England, right? And then when people are elected, you've got to build a coalition with these parties. To me, that feels like it's a really good model. And that's another whole conversation. But we are under minority rule right now, and that makes it very, very difficult. And it is a damned if you do, damned if you don't. The Democratic Party, honestly, it's like I don't even want to wear that label, right? It's just like I think I am more of an independent kind of voter than I have party loyalty right now because of how the party is and the way it's functioning. But that's, again, a longer term thing that we need to get to. But I think the Democratic Socialists of America, that coalition within the Democratic Party, I think over time can help make that, if it stays as a two-party system, make that party better. And I know that Scott is a part of another group that we're with, is that our we're trying to like infiltrate the party, right? Work inside the party and work on the edges of the party to make it better. And the way we make it better is we elect real, authentic leaders who give a shit both about the people and about making our democracy, a more robust and fair and equitable democracy. That's going to take a while, but we've got really good leaders that can get us there if we can just get them elected. I was at the fundraiser on Friday night. I was coerced in going, and I didn't buy a ticket. But a colleague of mine wanted us to have sort of a showing of progressive Democrats at the fundraiser, and we had 2 tables worth. So it was just really interesting to just sort of watch the dynamics of the party, and we've got a lot of work to do. Is all I
We
can
very
say.
much have a broken system that we sort of have to work within in order to build the system that we want to see replace it. And it really is a damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of situation. Like I said, we need to elect people that are willing to vote in ways that would disempower themselves in the end, to take away the power of the parties to maybe implement voting systems that would lead to a system that isn't a two-party system. I talked to an author a couple months ago who proposed a no-party system, which I think would be a very interesting thing worth pursuing. I wanted to pull up another graphic here. This is from Jess Piper, a dirt road organizer there in Missouri. Love what she puts out. And, I think she's generally a sympathetic figure who leans, progressive left, maybe, even tends to agree with things Democratic Socialists say, but like we have talked about repeatedly throughout the show, is worried about the branding. And she says, I wish the DSA would just call themselves FDR Democrats. They are advocating for the same social policies that benefit all of us, and it would take away one of the biggest problems we have with messaging, the dreaded word socialism. Bryce, I don't know. I think you're going to disagree with this because Democratic Socialists are maybe a little more than just FDR Democrats, but I'd like your thoughts on this quote.
Well, yeah, I disagree with it on its premise, and I also disagree with its conclusion. The DSA is a spectrum of people, and there are FDR Democrats who are DSA members, and they this is the kind of right wing of the DSA I was talking about, who do just want what's simply called capitalism with guardrails. They don't want to retool the entire economic logic of America. They want the CFPB. They want renewed antitrust rules. They want a robust safety net. This is, I think, is a majority position, like majoritarian position. But there are others who have a deeper critique of all that. There are others who say that, well, yes, I mean, you could just give Americans, nice little treats and, make sure that they don't get screwed by debt collectors and by housing speculation. But that doesn't solve, the imperial question, right? The fact that all of this wealth, all of the debt that we finance, the dollar system, all of that is built on a system of plunder, really. And you can't really have a full change of that system without addressing the fundamentals. And giving every American health care doesn't change those fundamentals. Ensuring that every American is housed doesn't change those fundamentals. And so a lot of people have a far deeper critique of the system. And it also doesn't address the fact that, just like the New Deal, if you leave these structures intact, then they'll just come back and devour your democracy slowly over time. I mean, this is precisely what happened. And so I think there are many people in the DSA who believe that. And so there's no good reason to call themselves FDR Democrats. And they have a fundamental critique of the Democratic Party, which itself has so many problems that calling themselves Democrats is just inaccurate. But also, I disagree with the conclusion, right? It doesn't matter what you call yourself. You're going to be called a communist. It doesn't matter what, how much you disavow Hassan Piker. It doesn't matter how much you disavow the USSR or China or Cuba or Vietnam or anyone. You're going to be, if you say there's nowhere, you're going to be called a communist. Obama was called a communist, and this man's a mass murderer. Okay. Like, like I said, people are calling Trump a communist because he doesn't want to, do some of the maximalist things that the far right is saying. They call him a communist. It's a word that the only people who I believe are using it effectively as a form of attack are the Democrats, and it's against their own. They're the ones who are succeeding in attacking, the right. We saw what happened with AES with Abdul. He is now disavowed Hassan Piker over some absolute nonsense, just real nonsense. It's the same way, like it's a disciplinary term rather than a descriptive term, and so running from the term won't really solve that issue. Calling yourself a Democrat, not only would it be lying, but it also wouldn't solve that issue. So I don't think that it's a priority to start labeling ourselves as Democrats.
Jesse, you've come up against this dynamic yourself personally, trying to have your feet in both worlds, like running as a Democrat, joining the Democratic caucus on the city council, but yet, when you exerted a modicum of independence, they booted you from the caucus. And I guess, where do you go forward from here? You're coming up on a full 4-year term. We got another I hate to zoom past the midterms here, but we got municipal elections coming up next year. Are you going to run as a Democrat again, or are you going to be an independent or on a socialist line?
It's such a good question, isn't it? I mean, I've updated my branding to say I am a socialist for District 13 to emphasize I'm not stepping one step back from that position. The label that I use, first off, isn't entirely up to me, right? Under what our state law is, as the courts have upheld, the Democratic Party has the right to remove me from the ballot and say I don't actually represent their brand. And so we'll have to see what happens next year. But on this concept of FDR Democrats, I think that, one thing people have talked to me about is like, oh gosh, you should just be more of an FDR Democrat and, just be like a social democracy where, yes, the taxes are higher, but, we get more things out of it. And, most people forget that in the United States until 1941, only the richest or the highest earning 5% of Americans paid any income tax at all. That was a tax that was on wealthy people and not on working class people. And it wasn't actually the New Deal programs that caused that to have to expand to the working class people. It was the war. It was World War II, where the United States was massively upscaling its productivity, drafting tons of people to fight in the war and go over 2 different oceans and fight in 2 different continents that were not our own, right? And so, already FDR was making a bunch of compromises based on the time. But I think, for example, working class people should pay far fewer taxes than we do today. I don't want a Denmark-style raise taxes on everybody because we don't need to. There's plenty of wealth that billionaires alone hold in this country. There's plenty of wealth that's held in the stock market, that's held offshores. The Panama Papers came out. Everyone freaked out, read them all, and then we've just moved on and never actually fixed those problems. The rich are not paying their fair share in taxes. Even people like Robert Reich and people who aren't socialists point this out on the regular. We all know it's true, despite all of these, ridiculous statements like, oh, well, actually, only the rich pay taxes. It's like, no, of the money that comes in, the rich pay a large portion of them because they have all the money. Most of us don't have any real wealth whatsoever. And so it's frankly ridiculous that we should be taxed on that. So I think that we need to move significantly past FDR, even in the very short term. We should be, I'm not running for Congress. And so Indianapolis doesn't have the right to change and make any kind of progressive taxation. And so there's only, I don't believe in demagoguery where I just claim that I'll push for policies that aren't possible from the seat I'm running for. But, anybody who's running for Congress who thinks that working people should pay any money at all, that's ridiculous. That is a gigantic concession to the rich and to capitalism. And so I don't think that we should just satisfy ourselves with, especially as a horizon, FDR's policies, because FDR's policies weren't proposed as a horizon. They weren't, FDR didn't run at the beginning of his term and say exactly what he would be able to get to in 4 years. He was on his back heels, pushing back against the biggest wave of strikes that we had seen in this country pretty much ever, which, now that our troops were all overseas, we couldn't just shoot dead all the strikers and their wives and children the way we did in previous decades. There really has always been class struggle in this country. And, it makes the rich uncomfortable when we talk about it, because that's the first sign of fighting back and winning that class struggle. But it's ongoing regardless. And we're being shot and killed anyway. We're being deported. We're being thrown in secret detention camps now in a more literal way. So no, I'm not an FDR Democrat, never have been, never will be. And, my job is to work for my constituents and do what I want within the spectrum of power that they elect me to have. But as just a person with a voice, I will always use my voice to point that out and to push in that direction, while still accepting it when my constituents, hold me back and just say, come on, Jesse, don't fight that fight right now. Let's make a concession. Let's make a moderation. But we make that decision together and in the open and transparently. And so even I have so many constituents who are like, Jesse, I think you're a crazy commie, but I would have a beer with you and I'd vote for you any day of the week. Because they know that, I'm being very transparent and forward about what I believe, but I'm not going to push that or force that on anybody else. I'm going to wait until I can convince everybody that we need to move in that direction. So sorry, get off my soapbox now.
No, you love to see it. So we're past the 90-minute mark, so I guess we should probably start wrapping up here. We didn't get to cover everything I wanted to talk about tonight, but I do want to give everybody a chance to say a final few words. And Debbie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think, Jesse, that the way that you talked about how you run as a leader, and I think it's the authenticity, it's listening to the constituents, it's working within the realm of power and authority that you have, while at the same time illuminating a vision that we can move towards, right? And I just think that makes perfect sense. We have serious structural and economic and class issues and problems in our country. And it's going to take all of us in this pluralistic society to be a part of the solution and just caring and listening to one another. So I think I love the way that you talked about how you're running your candidacy. And I think that is the recipe for voters. They're going to see the authenticity in you. And I think that if we can get candidates to do exactly that across the spectrum, up and down the ballot, I think we'll be electing the right people to begin to move us towards the kind of fundamental reformation that we need in this country.
And, Bryce, I guess some final words from you. Socialism is more than just the electoral component, right? It is not just running, it's doing.
No, absolutely. I mean, most of our conversations here have been about the electoral arena, but it is much more than that. If voting is where your understanding of politics begins and ends, then you've basically already seeded the ground to right wing, to the fascists, to the status quo. People need to get involved in their communities. People need to get involved in talking to their friends and talking with their co-workers. And also, if they have the time and energy, learn about some of this socialism business and learn about ways in which they can intervene to make their lives better. Because this is the base from which any electoral success is going to mean anything, and it's gonna be the base of any sort of long-term persistent challenge to the status quo. The people who are currently running things, they have institutions up the wazoo. They have country clubs, they have private schools, they have their own media that they consume. They have their own social worlds. We're gonna have APAC. Yes, they have APAC. We don't have that, and we don't have billions of dollars to make that happen. So we need to build it ourselves. And this is the most important project of our lifetime. Is figuring out how to build these persistent institutions that can challenge class power and eventually, make life better for people, and then eventually have fully automated luxury gay space communists.
Yeah, no, 100%. And Jesse, I guess I'm going to give the final words here to you tonight. We are in a changing planet. The climate is changing. The geopolitical dynamics are changing. Our political system and the way we approach politics and each other has to change as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Thanks for an awesome conversation, and thanks for everybody for being on. Thanks to Blythe out there in the world. I just really think Bryce hit the nail on the head there at the end, because whether it's Bernie Sanders running for president or Jesse Brown running for city county council, when you try to cohere a movement out of thin air, sometimes you can have surprises, right? Like you could have Zohran Mamdani pulling at 1% and then 10 months later becoming mayor of New York City. Like that does happen sometimes, but I think it happens because, quite frankly, our enemies have gotten lazy because they didn't have to work at it very hard for a while. They could just throw a bucket of money and that would always work. And even now, it mostly works, right? Like throwing enough money at it does win most elections in this country. And to Bryce's point, the only way we can combat that is with organized money and organized people, specifically organized to trust each other and have a base of support. And so, you'll see a lot of leftists talk about, do mutual aid. What they mean is like hand out food or clothes to people you'll never see again. And that is charity. And charity is a good thing to do, and it makes you feel good. But you don't build an organizing relationship with those people. Mutual aid is when you come to trust one another, to have a sense of solidarity, camaraderie, and class consciousness together, so that you share mutual interests. So that when a politician who you think could actually represent you and get you some material wins runs for office, you already have a base that you can use to both raise money and start knocking on doors. If I have to individually recruit every single person who knocks doors for me, I don't have enough time for that, and I probably lose next year. So organize in your building. If you're a renter, organize against the landlord. If you are at work, organize with your coworkers, form a union, make your union better if you already have one. No matter where you are, organize a neighborhood association, right? And just work to make sure your neighbors have what they need and it becomes a safe, clean place for you to live and play. There are things you can do right now. You don't need to be a politician. If you want to run for office, hit me up, because I will train as many people as possible to run against incumbents next year. But that is not the be all do all of socialism. We really just have to get organized as a class. And that means, unfortunately, you have to walk outside your house and talk to your neighbors, even though that makes you uncomfortable and feels cringe. So do it.
It can be scary out there sometimes, but yeah, you're right. Together is our only way through the current crisis and any crisis we may face. It is the most human way to be. Thank you all for joining me here tonight. Thank you, Debbie Asberry, Jesse Brown, and Bryce Greene. Also, thank Blythe Potter, who had to log off early. Hey, and thank you, our viewers, our listeners, folks in the chat was pretty lively tonight. Great to have everybody. Thank you for tuning in, for spending a part of your day or night with us. I will be back as I am usually on Sunday morning with Who's Left This Week, the only unapologetically progressive Sunday morning show in the Hoosier State. My guest this week, another socialist, Ben Davis, is running for State House in District 13. He will be on the show with me, as will Renee Mather, the secretary of the Washington County Democrats down there in Salem. That is at 10:30 a.m. on Progressive Indiana Network. Please join us. It'll be ready for you later in the afternoon as a podcast. Again, follow me on social media, on Blue Sky, Instagram, and Threads at whosleft.us, at Who's Left, and all the rest. Direct message me at any of those sites with feedback, tips, ideas, and concerns, or email me at scott@whosleft.us. Finally, last thing, please forward the show to a friend, have them pass it on too. Let's keep building this project and a truly democratic state, one conversation at a time. Until the next one, this has been the Who's Left Podcast. I'm Scott Aaron Rogers. Love each other, Indiana.